Just wait for that to kick in. Brilliant. Okay. Do you guys want to check that you can share your screen as well, actually?
Yeah.
Just make sure that works before we really get going.
You see that?
Yep, that works fine. Okay. So I'm just going to give you a quick intro in any case. So hello everyone, and welcome to this remote school lecture at Birmingham School of Architecture and Design. I'm Ollie Chapman, lecturer in architecture and coordinator of our Super Studio program. Of this, this lecture is part of that offer. We've got students from architecture, landscape architecture, interior architecture and design, and product and furniture design present with us, and perhaps some others as well. So welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us. And on this spring evening, we welcome Caukin Studio, who have offered to discuss their unique practice and some of their exciting work with us. The 6 members met through their shared love of architecture and humanitarianism while studying at Cardiff University, I think in 2015, if my research is correct, and developed the studio with the aim of giving students and young professionals the opportunity to design, build and travel. The group decided that they wanted to test out and apply their skills to real-world situations, realizing that as students, the physical and theoretical distance between studio and site was something that could and perhaps should be challenged. And while studying, the group have then won a series of accolades, including Cardiff University's Spark Enterprise Competition, a business competition which encourages new startups to push their business ideas and aspirations further, and the People's Choice Award in the Santander University's Entrepreneurship Awards, and perhaps some others that I haven't mentioned as well. But perhaps even more exciting than any awards or industry recognition is the democratic approach to education, design and construction and accessibility that forms the mission statement of Caukin. And I quote, "We believe that every human being should have the opportunity and tools to shape the spaces they inhabit. We should all benefit from the quality of life that is achieved through informed design." And so with that, I'm just going to hand straight over to the team from Caukin Studio now. We'll have some time for questions and answers after today's lecture. So if you have any comments, please make a note of them or pop them in the meeting chat, and feel free to join in the discussion at the end of the presentation.
Definitely. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that introduction. I guess also if anyone's got any questions whilst we're talking, then feel free to ask them then as well. Just share my screen and go full screen. Can you see that full screen?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, so I guess, we're going to talk a bit today about our practice, kind of how it came to be and some of our working methodologies and how we apply those to kind of real world situations. So we are Caukin Studio, a group of architectural designers that kind of have been working on community development projects in the last 6 years. So working on designing construction projects all over the world. And the name came from the origins of our founders, so Canada, the UK and Indonesia. So Ollie obviously very kindly presented our vision statement or mission statement, if you like. So we definitely believe that democratic education, quality design should be accessible to all. So without repeating that too much, I'll just say it very quickly. So we believe that every human being should have the opportunity and tools to shape the spaces they inhabit. We should all benefit from the quality of life that's achieved through informed design. And we believe that construction has to reduce its environmental impact on our planet. So that's our kind of vision statement or ethos. And we kind of try to implement this on our project through 3 main pillars. So the first of which is designing through collaboration. So that means that we are working with all of our stakeholders in every project, especially the end users, through every stage of a project. So be that through inception, brief formulation, all the design stages, construction on site, and even in kind of handover and in use. And that really helps to gain a core engagement of the end users and kind of gain that ownership over the building. We've then got learn through building. So, we really believe that getting stuck in on site and getting our hands dirty is really important to the process of learning through construction. And think that these kind of skills are actually really valuable to us as architects or as designers. The kind of things that we learn on site that you can't really teach on paper, and that way of kind of problem solving and reacting to situations on site is a really valuable skill. So we really believe in working alongside local people and getting it stuck in on the tools to kind of gain from that process. And then finally, we've got experience through immersion. So on almost all of our projects, we are living and working alongside the communities that we're building the building for. So we think this is really important, not only to help to gain a further ownership of the community over the building through this process of hosting international participants, but also for us to be able to learn and understand how these people are using their buildings, understand more about their way of life, and learn much more about the culture and context in a far deeper way than you would necessarily be able to if you're a tourist visiting a place like this. So it all started back when we were studying architecture in our second year of university at Cardiff University back in 2015, and we'd just finished second year, looking forward to our summer, a long summer ahead of us, with plenty of plans. But at the time, a lot of our friends and colleagues at university were kind of starting to do internships at various practices across the UK and Europe, kind of putting their experience through learning into real world practice. And we thought that this was something that we wanted to do, but maybe that there was a more hands-on way or more practical way to do this. So we set out by emailing and contacting tons of NGOs and charities all over the world, just kind of saying, look, we're an enthusiastic group of architecture students that want to design and build something that might help you further your mission or help you out in some way. So, we weren't claiming we were expert builders or even expert designers, but we thought that, through a collaboration, we might be able to, help in some way. So we set about contacting all these charities, and we're lucky enough that a charity called Friends of Koh Rong off the coast of the coast on an island off the coast of Cambodia had just got back to us, and they just set up a school on the island, obviously to give the kids an education, but also to give them a kind of safe haven to get to away from some of the negative impacts that tourism was starting to have on the island, such as drugs and alcohol. So they said to us, yes, we'd love it if you could build us a playground, somewhere that can give us an opportunity to teach outdoors, and somewhere to give the kids a kind of chance to explore through creative play and get away from those negative impacts of tourism. So this was the end product of that, Playscape, we called it. It was built over about a 7-week period with 10 of our friends from university at the time. And I think what we realized most through doing this project, that there was so much to gain in value from working with local people, from absorbing their knowledge of construction, of local context, of local materials and ways of life. And that was something that was really valuable to us as architecture students. But we also found that there was this kind of nice exchange of knowledge where we were actually helping to impart some of the design thinking and design skills in kind of working together on this project, in the hope that in future they'd be able to design their spaces more efficiently or with better ventilation, better lighting, that sort of thing. So we found this really nice exchange of knowledge on site that we felt we had to just keep doing more of.
So after that first project was funded through a Kickstarter campaign. I think, with it being our first project, we had to put in quite a lot of that upfront work to show that, we were pretty serious about this and dedicated. But we were fortunate that the Kickstarter was successful. We managed to raise enough to cover the material costs. But equally, we knew it wasn't a sustainable model to keep doing this each year. And it was something we were passionate about. We wanted to keep doing these projects. We wanted to offer it to other students to have the same experience. But we needed to find a new funding route and a more efficient way of doing this. So beyond that point, we kind of came down to a new, more official system. That was when we actually formed it, Caukin, as an organisation. And we determined 6 key stakeholders that are necessary for each project to happen successfully and smoothly. So the first of which, as Josh said earlier, is the local community, making sure that they're super involved right from the beginning, the brief making process, design, construction, all the way through to handover, so that they have that ownership of the project, of the building, and that they will use it and love it, and for the rest of its lifetime. There's then the NGO and charity partner. So on each of our projects, we will work with a local figurehead or a charity that has already built up the trust of the kind of neighborhood or the area over the course of a number of years. And their responsibility on the project is to identify the needs of the community, so doing evaluations of where we can have the most impact, organizing local logistics, and also fundraising for the actual build cost as well. So that was taking that responsibility off our hands and allowing us to focus much more on the design and construction process. There's then the international participants, so you guys, architecture, engineering, design students, and even wider than that, that are interested in applying their skills into a new context, but equally learning from a much more diverse range of people than you might otherwise come across. So learning sort of on-site, hands-on construction skills, working in very different climates and with very different people as well. There's then the local skilled workers. So this is often an extension of the local community, but also the NGO as well. So we'll work in the early stages of a project to identify a few people that have key skills that will be necessary for the project. So this could be bricklaying, welding, carpentry, and their role, as well as general construction, is to teach ourselves, it's to teach the international participants, and it's to teach younger members of the community as well that are looking to get upskilled and increase their employability in the future. There's then the sponsors and donors of a project. So this will be an extension of the NGO's network and our network, and it will be people inputting or donating financially to cover the material costs, or it will be people offering their services pro bono. So typically we'll have engineers and environmental design specialists helping to increase the value of the project, making sure that we're pushing the materials to the limits. And finally, there's us as a facilitator. So our job on a project is really kind of overseeing all the sort of nitty-gritty bits and pieces, overseeing that all of the different stakeholders have an equal say in the project, and everything's running kind of smoothly. So kind of filtering down all these different ideas into a workable design that satisfies all the difficult challenges that are presented. So kind of hand in hand with the coming up with the stakeholders, we refined the project selection and project objectives into a little bit more of a formal arrangement. So when we're selecting a project, it's important that it's something which has been identified and requested by the community themselves. So something which is very key to their way of life, and isn't a project that's just been dreamt up by somebody and then is imparted on the end users. Equally, it needs to be a project where we can see what value we can add. So if it's a project where perhaps a building isn't actually the best solution to the issue, or it's a building that can be achieved successfully without our input, then we'll happily step back and say, look, this project's not for us. But likewise, the projects that really kind of excite us are those ones where we can utilize our network of expertise and resources that we have access to here to really add as much value as possible. So whether that's in structural strength against cyclones, flooding, earthquakes, or it's in more technical design with passive design strategies, making more comfortable learning environments that don't overheat, that aren't too dark, all of these different types of things. And so that kind of leads on to the project objectives and what kind of buildings we're going to be taking on. First thing we'll look for is that it's a community-wide social impact. So this is typically education, health facilities, or community halls, and something which is going to improve day-to-day living and isn't just specifically targeting one family or one individual. So much more kind of a broader, wide application of its impact. We then look for a long-term economic impact, and this is in relation to both boosting the local economy during the process of construction. So whilst we're there, increasing employability, increasing skills and education, but also in the actual function of the end product as well. So looking at briefs where the building is then used to generate its own income, and that income is then used by the community to create self-sustaining systems and future development. And finally, low or a positive environmental impact. This will be in relation to both the materials we're using, so keeping the embodied energy as low as possible. You're looking at where we can reuse or reclaim or upcycle materials, and also specifically working with charities that have a specific environmental agenda or are fighting the climate crisis in some way. So we completed that first project in Cambodia. We, while still at university, just after our third year, we completed 2 more playgrounds in Indonesia. And during this process is when we were kind of setting up the formalities. You know, one of the good things about starting this very early on and starting it whilst we were at university is that we did have this network of tutors that were willing to offer advice and guidance as well. That kind of helped, you know, create a bit of a path for us. And we'd kind of, you know, finished these 3 projects, all playgrounds, and felt like we were at the stage now to see how we could push ourselves, increasing the size and complexity of these buildings we were working on. So we started the process again, started reaching out to charities, and we were very fortunate to hear back from Nganga Giving Foundation in Fiji. So this was, you know, a bit of a shift away from Southeast Asia where we'd been working previously. But they'd had a cyclone in 2016, which caused, you know, real widespread destruction all over the country. So there was a massive need for new buildings and also new approaches to you know, redesigning and rebuilding these structures so that they can, you know, better withstand in the future. So this was the first, you know, since this project, or the 2 projects, we've been back kind of 5 or 6 times. Completed a project with the same charity year on year, and become quite a, you know, a good base for us to evaluate projects, improve on them, and we'll talk about some of those projects a little bit later as well.
So I suppose one of our key challenges when we're working on these kind of projects is that we're kind of balancing all of the design considerations equally so that we can come up with the most efficient building which achieves the most value and can be used as best possible. So some of those things are, the first of which is budget. Probably quite obviously, when we're working with charities and NGOs as clients, we're often dealing with very much a limited pot of funding or a red line budget. You know, we can't get halfway through a project and realize that actually we've run out of money, we've spent it all on materials and we need some more. We can't go back to the charity and ask for more money. So when we're designing, that means we've got to really make sure that we're counting every screw, nail, bit of timber that goes into the building. And equally that when we're considering the brief and the design function, it's about making sure we can achieve as much value out of the space as possible. So getting rid of unnecessary elements or extravagant, you know, details, for example, that are just not necessary. There's then climate. So, you know, we're working in a number of different climates and contexts all across the world, each of which have their own challenges. Things like earthquakes, cyclones, you know, flooding, that sort of thing. So it's making sure that we're using that network of partners to make sure we can add as much value to combat some of those climatic issues, be it, you know, high wind loading or, you know, high humidity. Working with those specialists to overcome these. We've then got materials. So this one's a really important one to us. We only want to work and use in our designs local materials that can be sourced locally to site and are available to local people once we've left. There's 2 reasons for this. First of all, if it's coming from locally to site and is produced locally to site, it contains a much lower embodied carbon, which is better for the planet. But then also, if we're specifying materials, let's say, for example, from New Zealand, and we're importing them to Fiji or Vanuatu, for instance, a steel footing, it might achieve a stronger building in the long run. But once we've left the project and we've left the site, because that material isn't necessarily obtainable by the local community in future, it means that they're not going to take or learn from that design process and those design elements and use that material again. So it's trying to use local materials in ways that kind of add value to them through making them stronger, or, you know, innovate with them in such a way that can, you know, provide value to the space. We've then got skill levels. So obviously we're working with international participants who, many of which have never picked up a hammer in their lives, or even sometimes local people that are relatively unskilled when it comes to construction. So when we're designing, that means we're trying to come up with elements of a build which are repetitive in nature, or can kind of, for example, portal frames or building trusses. We can get a team on site, a relatively unskilled team on site, building one or two, learning from that process. And once they've learned those skills, can then repeat the process time and time again. And suddenly you've got kind of 10 frames that are built in a very short time succession. And that kind of learning curve is quite exponential. So, it might be that the first 2 frames take a week to build, but after that, the next 10 are built in a couple of days. And that kind of also links onto the time constraints. So often we're on site for fairly short periods of time. So obviously it does relate to the scale of the building, but every building we've built to date has been completed in somewhere between 1 week up to about 3 months. So when we're designing, we have to be thinking about ways in which we can get as many construction processes happening on site at one time. So whether that's a team that are digging and setting out and laying foundations at one part of the site, whilst we've then got another team building those kind of prefabricated elements elsewhere. And that means that usually around the halfway point of a project, that those elements can kind of come together, and you go from some frames flat on the ground and some holes that have been filled for foundations, to suddenly like a building shell and a building structure out of nowhere. And it's quite a rewarding thing to see all of that hard work for the first kind of half of a project come together at that midpoint under those kind of tight time constraints. So the next one is information, or rather lack of. Again, because we're working in some fairly remote locations, it's not always or almost never possible to get a surveyor on site to get really detailed site drawings and kind of understand the site in that way. So we're often designing from things such as Google Earth, Google Maps, even photos that have been sent to us by the NGO or someone from the local community. So when it comes to design, we have to be quite flexible so that we can kind of allow for unforeseen circumstances that might happen. We might not have picked up in our desktop surveys or through photographs, that when we arrive on site, we can quickly adapt that design, and because of its flexibility, we can overcome those issues fairly quickly. So we typically would design somewhere between 80 to 90% of the building before we get there. So usually always all of the structural elements that need sign off are designed before we get to a site. And then once we're on site, we can specify some of the finer details, positioning of doors, windows, those kind of things that help us to adjust to those site circumstances. And then finally, not necessarily on every project, but it seems to be on more and more projects as we work in more remote locations, is access. So how we get materials to the site. So this example here is the Bulabatiki Coconut Oil Cooperative building that we built on in 2019, or rather a photo of the process of that building. So the only way to get to the site, or rather to the island even, was through a really small gap in the reef that only a fiberglass boat could fit through. It would then go through that gap, dock up on the beach, materials would be unloaded onto the beach and then carried to the site. So that meant that when we were designing, we obviously couldn't get materials that were larger than the size of those fiberglass boats, or that would be too heavy. And we had to also factor the cost of the back and forth between the main shipment from the mainland on the boat on the right onto this kind of small fiberglass boat on the left, and kind of balancing all of these things in equal measure to hopefully try and come up with the optimum design solution. So we're going to talk through, I think, 4 or 5 key projects, and kind of each one has a key talking point or element around it. So the first of which is this one, Ramwas School in Vanuatu. So this one actually had a really interesting climatic element to the design brief. So our partner on this one, the Tambok Project charity, had basically been doing some scoping exercises. They'd been traveling around the island of Pentecost in Vanuatu after the cyclone that occurred in 2015 to assess damage and assess need for communities on the island. And they had assessed a certain need for a school and a classroom in this village of Ramwas, which they'd also been sending learning materials to prior to the cyclone. But they found that it had this really interesting kind of climatic issue, in that because of the elevation of the village on the mountain, it had really high relative humidity all year round. So in the previous classroom that was destroyed by the cyclone, they'd experienced lots of condensation on their blackboards, which meant that when they were writing on them in chalk, it was really difficult to write on them. And equally, the learning materials that the charity had been sending them, they'd soak up all of this moisture and would get kind of quite sodden and unusable or hard to write in fairly quickly. So the charity had been sending out repeat books and workbooks and exercise sheets and things, on quite a frequent basis. So they said to us, we'd love if you could design us this kind of library space that would somehow prolong the life of these learning materials. So we worked with environmental design specialists at Cardiff University to come up with a low-tech, low-energy method, natural method that could kind of hopefully overcome this issue. Obviously, it's not a case of sticking a dehumidifier and an air conditioning unit in this building. We're in a village that is very remote, that has very unreliable power, that's driven by a generator anyway. So the idea was that the library was clad in these metal roofing sheets that were painted black. So the heat from the sun would be absorbed into the space and lower the relative humidity in the space. And when that's coupled with lots of natural ventilation, this moisture-rich air was sucked out of the space, hopefully achieving a lower relative humidity. That, as well as designing the bookshelves so that they could create more airflow around the books and more space between them, and specifying materials that can kind of hopefully absorb and wick away some of that moisture, like as simple as using lots of timber that had been cut into short sections so that there's lots of kind of end grain, and that acts as essentially a sponge that can kind of soak up some of this moisture, taking it away from the books. Since we've completed this building, we've been monitoring the relative humidity, temperature, and other factors within the space, and found that we've achieved a reduction of 20% relative humidity in relation to some of the other spaces in the school, which is really great to see.
So this was the 9D Community Hall, which we completed 2 years ago now, 2018. It was quite an interesting project for us. It was quite a big step up again from what we'd previously done. It was the first time we'd used this kind of these huge pine poles as part of the construction technique. And it's probably, as you can imagine, there's not really any cranes in these villages or big machinery or lifting equipment. So when these arrived on the back of a truck, which had previously been loaded up from the kind of neighboring town, then we had a bit of an issue on our hands of how to offload all of these pine poles, and about 500 kilograms each, and also lift them all the way up onto the site and then, manhandle them into place. So we were quite fortunate that Fijians love a good bit of exercise, and the local rugby team kind of got all hands on deck and pulled them straight off the truck and lifted them all up into place in pretty good timing. But again, just another kind of design consideration for this is the sort of thing. These are the sort of things that we need to know quite early on in advance. The brief for this project was quite interesting. The 9D community are quite well known for their meke performance, which is a traditional Fijian dance. They have visitors from the surrounding area, but also international visitors and tourists who come and watch them perform, and it creates a bit of sustainable income for the community as well. So they had this kind of interesting addition to the brief. So as well as it being the typical functions that you might find in other villages, such as weddings, funerals, ceremonies, meetings, this type of thing, they also wanted it to be a space that was quite kind of theatrical and that they could perform and create a bit more of a buzz around their dancing. So there's that kind of informed the crescendoing shape of the structure. And there's kind of two stages. There's one out the front, which leads onto the big village green. So on a nice sunny day, you can have people out on the green watching a performance, or in the evenings, or when it's raining, you can move inside. And again, you've still got this kind of theatrical type setup. So with these projects in the South Pacific, and increasingly now in other areas as well, we're able to go back and work with the same charities. So in 2019, we were back in the same area and could conduct a post-occupancy survey and see where the building was, where it was succeeding and where it wasn't, and what we could improve on in the future. And I think the most interesting point for us was that, as well as all of these typical functions, they'd now been using it as a kindergarten 2 days a week, which was a kind of a new function that hadn't previously been identified. And again, it kind of highlighted the necessity to make these spaces very flexible and adaptable for very quickly changing needs. So with this news, the government had actually got involved, seen that it had been successful, and asked them to increase it to 5 days a week and expand it to primary age kids as well. And as part of that initiative, they would teach or educate, train up a local person to run it as a school, registered school. A few other interesting things about this building as well. So in pretty recently now, I think it was actually just December, there was a couple of cyclones came straight through this area. Again, same with all of our other projects built around the same sort of vicinity. And all of these projects were then used as evacuation centers. So it's very, it's crucial that these are, almost over-engineered to the point where it seems crazy at the start, but you never know when these cyclones are going to hit, and the frequency is increasing and the strength is increasing. And all of those, that thankfully survived the storms unscathed.
So this one is the Evergreen School, which was completed in Zambia again in 2019. So this one, a charity called Mothers of Africa came to us, and they'd been working with a school, with Evergreen School, for a number of years, and they'd kind of observed classroom sizes grow from about 50 kids all the way up to 150 kids per teacher or per class. So they wanted us to build 4 large classrooms and a teacher's office that could help to reduce classroom sizes to around 40 pupils, and hopefully give those kids a bit more of an opportunity to access learning without having so many people within one class. But I think it was also another really important project for us, because sometimes, or fairly often in some of the contexts we're working in, gender prescribed job roles are in play, and often it's a bit of a taboo for women to work in construction. So we felt that this project was a real opportunity to use, to lead by example. So we made a point of employing a local construction force that was 50% male and 50% female. And again, even more important, because it was a school construction. So, females in the school could see these strong, capable women working on this site, and hopefully kind of, broaden their horizons and realize that a career in construction is something that is totally viable, and doesn't have to be the kind of, they don't have to stick to those kind of gender prescribed norms that exist in some of these places.
This was one of our first sort of more major projects in the UK. It was working with the Eden project down in Cornwall. Hopefully most of you will be familiar, and if you're not, I definitely recommend it as a visit. It's a visitor's attraction that is completely centered around ecosystems and the environment. So they've got 2 huge biomes encapsulating tons of different species from all over the world. But it was 2019, they became a national bee reserve, and to mark the occasion, they wanted to create a kind of sculptural beacon that would draw people up to this new area of the site. So they've got this new wild meadow to the right-hand side, and this structure houses a live beehive. So there's 50,000 bees living behind those double doors, and as you open it, there's a kind of glass screen, so you can see all the inner workings of the bees making the honey. And as well as this, we worked with a bee charity that's working to conserve the national or the native Cornish bee. And so we were kind of trying to give an opportunity for them to demonstrate some of the research that they've been doing, and convey to the public how they could get involved and create an impact in their own homes.
So this one we spoke about earlier, getting the materials onto the beach and onto the site, as well as a building that could hopefully have some sort of economic impact. So this is the Bula Batiki coconut oil processing plant, again in Fiji, located on Batiki Island. So on the island there are 4 villages which are made up by 300 villagers, and they had come together to form a cooperative where they were producing raw virgin Fijian coconut oil, which they'd been selling across Fiji. And they'd kind of upscaled their production so much so that the process and the making of the coconut oil was being done in their homes, in the church, in their community halls. So it kind of, taken up all of the spaces that they have available to them. They basically needed this dedicated space to produce the oil. But not only that, the space was, or the brief was, to create a space that could achieve kind of food hygiene and safety standards that would mean that they'd be able to sell their products to a wider audience overseas, so Australia, New Zealand, and further afield, as well as somewhere that would cater exactly to the production process. So the kind of plan of the building as you go in from one end through to the other follows each stage of construction, and then each space within it kind of caters to that. And since this has been completed, we've kind of kept in contact and found that they're now looking at expanding to do other products as well as coconut oil. So I think they're looking at a contract with Patagonia to produce surf wax that's shaped in a coral, as well as using some of the waste products of the production, so the coconut husks, to create products such as sunglasses. So that's really great to see as well.
So with each of these projects, we want to make sure that we're creating a longer legacy, and that we're not just involved right from the start to the build and the end of the project. That actually these are much longer term initiatives and much longer term goals as well. So what comes hand in hand is evaluating the project, 1 year on, 5 years on, etc. Making sure that we are learning from our past, learning from how the buildings are being used, whether they're successful or not, and how we can improve when working in these locations again. So this was, I think, at the very start, or towards the start, I talked about the first projects we did in Fiji, one of which was a kindergarten. So when we first arrived on site, there was 8 students being taught in the local canteen, obviously very dingy, kind of dark place. So the brief was a, much dedicated, nice kindergarten space, toilets, etc., better lighting, better learning environment, and just generally a dedicated space to teach. And 1 year later, we went back to see the site and had seen that the attendance had risen from 8 students all the way up to 30 or 35 students, and they were now having to turn away new applicants. So, it was great in one hand, like they'd made the building their own, they'd filled it with all their drawings, it obviously attracted a whole new host of children from the surrounding villages and settlements, but equally it kind of demonstrated an unexpected need for it to be even larger than previously anticipated, and this wasn't something we'd kind of factored in. So we went back to the charity we worked with on this project, discussed the issue, and decided to create a second classroom which would be used by a new teacher that they'd recently hired, and that would allow them to run 2 classes simultaneously and then increase attendance even further up to over 50 students. So we did this project in 2019, went back. It was nice to stay in the same village again, meet everybody up, and kind of kick off that relationship on a more deeper level. And as part of that first project, we noticed the building was being used as a kind of meeting space before and after school by the teachers and the parents. So we wanted to create a little bit of a canopy structure, experimentation with some timber, and bit of a play space just to give them space to do that. So as well as evaluating individual projects, we took the opportunity during coronavirus, as our projects were postponed, to put some time aside to really look back over the last 5 or 6 years and analyze what kind of impact we were having and where we could improve on the business as a whole. So not just looking at individual projects, but the way we operate our projects, how we can improve on the whole process. And I think something which we try and convey, hopefully in this lecture, is the process of architecture can be just as impactful as the finished outcome of the project. So I think there's quite a lot of it. Understandably, there's a lot of waiting around architecture and the final project and the finished building and what that project's then used for. But actually the whole process of everything that happens beforehand is a perfect opportunity for social impact, educational impact, economic impact. So hopefully you can see that in our projects, and that's something we're trying to integrate even further. I think even on private or commercial projects, there's tons of opportunities to integrate this into further. And something we're looking at doing now, which I think Josh will mention with upcoming UK projects, is collaborating with bigger practices that maybe don't typically have the same kind of community engagement techniques that we implement. So collaborating with them to kind of harness both our skills and their skills as well.
Yeah, so I suppose moving forward and looking forward to things we're working on next and soon. Obviously, coronavirus has had a fairly large impact on our work, being mostly international. So it's kind of encouraged us to look closer to home, which was always something that we were doing as well, but it's, I suppose, forced us to do that even more so. So looking at ways in which the process that we've come up with and how architecture can tackle or raise awareness about social issues that are close to home. So things like mental health, loneliness, homelessness, that sort of thing. So looking to create smaller scale projects that, maybe design and build installations that help to raise awareness around an issue or help to tackle it in some way through a spatial intervention. So we've been working on a few kind of small scale art installations that are coming up, looking to work with festivals as well, on how obviously festivals are pop-up events that usually require some sort of space, stages, but also other things around the kind of festival auditorium or area. So how they can build those kind of short-term installations in ways that can contribute to a circular economy or isn't wasteful and doesn't use materials that then just get thrown away at the end. So looking to do more of those sorts of things. It's also looking at ways in which we can use competitions to further some of our work, or look at ways in which we can kind of break into new sectors through competitions. And equally looking to answer briefs to competitions that maybe don't necessarily have an environmental or social impact agenda, but answering them in a way that can kind of impart that on our design or our proposal. And then again, looking to collaborate with more people, as Harry said, larger architecture practices, but equally, students and other people that are enthusiastic, in an effort to create a kind of a community of people that are interested in this kind of line of work. I think we definitely believe that strength is in numbers, and that collaboration is the key to successful projects and to kind of further projects. And then also looking towards ways in which we can kind of further our educational offering virtually. So obviously to date, or at least until fairly recently, most of the kind of education projects we've been working on had been through physical education and looking at how we can educate through the construction process. But actually we found that there was a massive a massive appetite for people wanting to learn about our design process and how the process of a project comes about, how we interact with the kind of stakeholders that we're working with. So looking at coupling that kind of thirst for people wanting to know those sorts of things, but with research topics and research projects that we've been looking at as a practice generally anyway. So using these virtual workshops as a way to create a body of work and resource towards these kind of research projects. So this one that we conducted last summer was around the issue of sustainable prototype housing in the South Pacific. So obviously cyclones and hurricanes are becoming ever more frequent now, especially as climate change is accelerating and the severity of these is also increasing. So even more so, people's houses are getting destroyed. People are then rebuilding their houses from the ruins. And then this is a kind of cycle that just is never ending and keeps occurring. So looking at ways that we could potentially come up with a body of work or research that could inform either a prototype design, a handbook, or kind of a series of test prototypes that could then be rolled out and impact people on a much wider scale, potentially on a country-wide scale, rather than kind of an isolated number of communities with one project.
So that kind of leads us on to this year. We're hoping to take on 4 projects this summer as open sort of participant projects. Those ones would be Vanuatu, Zambia, Indonesia, and Fiji. Obviously, there is increasing, uncertainty about whether these projects will be able to go ahead with coronavirus. But equally, all of these projects have a corresponding virtual workshop that Josh just mentioned, which is all of the work that goes on beforehand before we get on site. So how we started the organization, everything we've talked about in this lecture, but in a lot more detail. Community design techniques, community engagement techniques, and also a whole host of other speakers as well, getting involved with the tutorials, guest panel discussions. So if anybody is interested in finding out a lot more about how we work and the types of ways in which we find these projects, then that's probably the best place to do that. And if you've got any questions, feel free to ask.
So that kind of brings us to the end of our presentation. A little bit of a shameless plug. If anyone wants to follow us on Instagram, it's @Caukin Studio. Please feel free to do so. But yeah, we welcome any questions if anyone has any. Thank you.
Oh, and one final thing, those virtual workshops actually start on Monday, so it's very short notice, but if you are interested, then tomorrow is your day, your last day.
Brilliant. Well, that's fantastic lecture. Thank you very much. And I think the invite for those virtual workshops should be really interesting to our students as well. Thank you both very much for that. I wonder if there are any questions from anyone watching. If there are, then feel free to either put up your hand and say them, but if you'd prefer to remain silent, then feel free to drop them in the meeting chat as well. I might start off with one that I'm sure you've kind of been asked before quite a few times, but what's, of all of the kind of challenges that you've had to work through into making sure that the work you're producing is as sensitive as it possibly can be, what do you think has kind of led you to a point where you feel like you've kind of navigated that successfully? And is it through research? Is it through the people you've met? Is it through repeatedly working in the same areas? Kind of how do you get to that point?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a kind of a number of those things. Research has definitely been a key one, especially when we're working in a new location that we've kind of not returning to. It's always been about learning as much as we can digitally, and we also appreciate and understand that you could spend a year researching something online, but you could spend a week in that place and you'll instantly learn way more about it. But that's, I think, where the kind of NGO partner or local partner comes into it as well. We're making sure that we're collaborating with the right NGOs and the right organisations. So, working with organisations that are either permanently positioned in that location or have worked there for many, many years and have built up that trust of the local community and have a much better and deeper understanding of ways of life and some of those kind of cultural sensitivities. So hinging off that relationship as much as possible has always been really important. And I think we can always tell very quickly from when we start talking to a new potential project partner which ones are the right ones to work with and which ones are the ones that do kind of understand the community in that respect. I mean, I don't know if there's anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think just reiterating the point about everything that happens off-site, and when you do arrive to the location, all of that learning process is sped up, kind of 10 times as much. And arranging the way in which we live and the accommodation, how we organise food and everything in a way which tries to remove the idea of kind of guest or host roles. So making sure that we're getting stuck in with cooking, cleaning, organising all these things, so that it's much more of an integrated sort of living process as well as obviously on site. So that whole kind of construction period is, fast tracks that kind of getting to know them, how they live, little things that no one's going to tell us before we arrive about certain nuances about how they might cook, where the toilets might be located, which is just completely normal for them. As soon as you're living there, instantly become, instantly much more easy to understand, and you can just see all these little things that happen day-to-day village life, really.
Yeah.
And that kind of going back to a location means that all of that knowledge then can just instantly be put into the design process. Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if Juliet, do you want to ask yours? or would you prefer that we read it out? Sorry, horrible Wi-Fi, so we'll read it out in that case. Julia asks, what would you say have been the most teachable mistakes you have made, either within building your business or within a project?
That's a good question. I mean, I think we've obviously made, like everyone does, loads of mistakes along the way. I think that is the one thing that makes us learn in the best way possible. You always learn from your mistakes and never make the same one twice.
I think working on projects that aren't 100% guaranteed yet, it's easy to get swept up into a great story, even if a project has a great background, there's a really great NGO working on it. If there's no funding in place, or it's there's still so much logistical issues for it to actually go ahead, it's trying to hold off on getting carried away and starting that design process and putting hours and weeks of worth of work in, just for it to end up on the curbside and not actually go ahead. And that's a lot of time that's put into it, that's wasted. And if you're not charging for that time, again, even worse. So I'd say in the early stages, maybe we get overly excited about every new opportunity a little bit too quickly. Whereas now we maybe a little bit more skeptical about new projects, take a lot more time to decide whether, yes, this is definitely going to happen, making sure that everything's in place, contracts in place, all the boring stuff, and then we'll start the whole design process, because otherwise you're just going to end up, wasting a lot of time.
I think an important element of that was, though, that maybe some of those naiveties at the start were what spurred us on to do it, and just kind of get stuck in. And I suppose that maybe that's slightly guerrilla way of working, in that we are accepting we might make some mistakes, but that we will learn from them and can improve on them.
And so in returning to the kind of making sure you're not going to unnecessary levels of detail too early on in a project, I suppose, is that something that you map against the kind of RIBA work stages or things like that, or is that where the input of your tutors came in?
That's something that we hadn't kind of, obviously at the start we weren't necessarily doing as much, definitely didn't have formal processes in place in terms of like how we track our hours or how we compare the work stages that we're in, which is definitely something that through doing our masters and working with some of those contacts we have at university, and then also just generally gaining more experience as we've gone on, we've kind of started to apply that thinking and those methods that help us to make sure we don't get carried away. And I suppose that's all part of learning how to run a business or how to run an architecture practice as well, I suppose.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think it's difficult not to do, isn't it, when you get swept up in the in the fantasy of a project sometimes.
Downfall of every architect, yeah.
I think there's a hand up from Nathan, and there's another kind of question in the chat as well. If we go to Nathan, if you want to say yours first.
There we go. Yeah, it probably links into what Ollie kind of just mentioned, really. Absolutely love the dynamic, love the process. And I've just written an essay on it, and I'm doing a project at the minute that links in quite nicely as well. And it's something that I'm trying to push a little bit more, because I'm a part-time student, so I'm in practice currently. And it's quite difficult sometimes to try and link into practice, because I keep getting told time is money and we need to not kind of get involved with a client too often. And anyway, so kind of linking in with what Ollie said, how the cynic in me, I can't help it, says how do you make this commercially viable? Like, obviously head rules the heart, but with these kind of projects, it's difficult to, like you've said, it's not to get carried away and go with the heart. So how do you at the end of the day, you've got to put food on the table. So how does that?
How on earth do we make money? It's a good question. It's one we get all the time. And as we say, it's definitely been a learning process to not get too carried away by a dream brief or a project that we feel has got a really strong need. So basically, we've got kind of two streams of income. Obviously, we're doing these workshops, construction and design workshops, which incur a fee, and then that pays for some of our time. But we're also charging a kind of, like many architecture practices would, a design fee to our clients, who are generally NGOs or charities. But that design fee, because of that other source of income, is typically reduced from the kind of design fee that a standard architecture practice might charge. And that helps us to put obviously more money within the budget towards the materials and the labour and that sort of things. But equally, because we're offering almost like a one-stop shop for construction projects, we are doing the project management, construction management, architectural design. We're doing the quantity surveying and the construction. There's a lot of efficiencies within that when you're working with a single party or multiple parties for each of those things I just named, often time and costs can be massively elevated. So because we are orchestrating all of that, it helps us to reduce a lot of the time we do actually have to spend on some of these projects, to hopefully make it a bit more commercially viable. But it's always a difficult thing to try and do. And I think, to be fair, that over time, as we built up a portfolio and also our experience in this kind of niche, we've been able to approach or work with larger charities that do have more budget to work on much bigger scale projects that could also achieve a higher impact, but equally can pay our bills, I suppose.
Yeah, cool. And just, sorry, I don't want to hog the mic. Just how, obviously, given the current climate and the fact that coronavirus is influencing everything, how are you finding the transition to these projects overseas to the UK market? Because obviously it's completely different, and the level of projects and the scope of works are vastly different, and obviously regs and planning issues and everything else. So is your bread and butter the overseas work? Is that where you see the majority of your work?
Yeah, no, again, it's a good question. I mean, something we've always done, and I think has been a strength in what we have managed to do, is hinge on the massive network that we've been able to build. Starting from university, obviously, I think we maybe only realised it when we finished university, but we had access to like an unbelievable network of educators and professionals that also have their own networks. So that transition has been eased by that. Obviously, we've built up a fairly good network of contacts in the UK that architects, engineers, people we work with that can help us through some of those trickier kind of questions with regards to planning regulations and all that sort of stuff. Obviously we are still working to planning regulations in the countries we're working in, and I think that was actually one of the other questions in the chat. Obviously, planning regulations in Zambia, for example, are of way less than they are here, but we tend typically to work to a higher standard of regulations than would be in the local country that we're working in. So we are kind of tailoring some of our process to those UK standards, or if it's maybe a project in the South Pacific, then we're working to Australia and New Zealand standards. So that's kind of helped with that transition. But I think equally we see our the way we're taking our business and our work in. We're trying to diversify it as much as we can, I suppose. I don't think we necessarily consider ourselves a straightforward architecture practice. We're looking at more, I suppose, commercial development opportunities at the moment, both in the UK and overseas, that also balance kind of the profit with impact and purpose. And we think that's the way business should be done, and all businesses should do that. But yeah, that's kind of the direction we're trying to take it in now.
Cool. Cheers.
I suppose kind of related to that, I have another query, which is the
Sorry,
role that...
I'm going to turn my Alexa off because I can hear it. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but Alexa, time it off.
I wonder if the role that you have as the kind of almost project manager or architect and so on, which is in the UK now and in lots of the West now, is kind of almost a historic role. Perhaps might be seen as still aspirational, but perhaps unattainable, or even a little bit foolhardy in some circumstances. Is that, when you're working in other locations, is the attitude the same as that, or is it much more normal?
I'd say a lot of the time that there is just a lot of the stages that we might normally typically go through in the UK are just skipped altogether. So the idea of having an architect involved often is just, doesn't even cross anyone's mind. The furthest it might go in terms of design is the engineers just laying out a grid and what kind of things they need to be to stand up. So in that sense, typically a lot of the people we'll work with, or charities that we've worked with before we've got involved in collaborating on projects, the way in which they've delivered it before is they will just skip straight through to an engineer that might work on it very cheaply or pro bono, and then they'll just build it. But the issues with that obviously means that there's no real consideration for how this can be better for the same budget. Can you make these classrooms way brighter, way nicer, way less less humid and hot, and therefore increase people's attention spans, therefore increase their grades, and then there's a whole knock-on effect to these different systems. And that's kind of the way in which we approach conversations with new clients is, yes, you can probably do this without an architect, but actually if you want to get us involved, there's a whole host of knock-on effects that and increased impact that we can achieve through working with you, and therefore hopefully increase their future donations and their general mission anyway. So yes, it's a cost up front, but actually it's a long-term investment into the community that you're working with and your general mission. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, but yeah.
Interesting, thank you. There's a comment from Fidosi. Fidosi, do you want to read out yours, or do you have dodgy Wi-Fi as well?
Hi, how are you able to do the first project as a second-year student without the qualifications?
Sure. I mean, technically you don't necessarily need any qualifications to design a building, or at least, it doesn't, the title of an architect obviously in the UK is protected, but not necessarily the role specifics. I think for us it was, we were also looking to work in places initially that, again, like the question we just answered, an architect isn't even, no one understands what an architect is in some of these places. So it was just, I think it was more a case of just convincing the partner in that first instance, the charity that we were working with, Friends of Go Wrong, that they should kind of, take a chance and give us a go and work with us on the project. I think it was just an acknowledgement that it was going to be a learning process for everyone involved. It didn't necessarily mean that we were totally unqualified. Obviously, we'd done 2 years of architecture school, so we had a fairly basic understanding of design that we could bring to the table. But I think it was just a case of getting stuck in and doing it, and not necessarily worrying too much or overthinking some of the consequences. But then equally, to combat some of those consequences, it's doing as much research as we could and trying to understand as much as we could before we went into it, so that we could kind of plan for every eventuality of the project.
Yeah, we were definitely naive at the time, and it was extremely sort of nerve-wracking. That first flight out there, it's kind of like suddenly you got tons of responsibility on your shoulders to deliver this project, and you've never built anything like that before. I mean, we'd done a couple of build modules at the end of first year and the end of second year, so we had a little bit of sort of hands-on experience, but very minimal, and that's why we hinged off the local community so much in that regard, and their skills in building their own homes, and then hinging off the local charity partner as well, and their sort of logistical knowledge. So I think it's just the case is just to collaborate with people. If you have a gap in your skill or a gap in your confidence, then just find somebody that can fill that. And if you're at university, then you've got tutors around you that have experience with, in practice and in profession. And if there's still a gap missing and you're looking to do a project such as we were abroad, then find somebody in that host country that can help you out with your questions. And when it's a charitable project as well, then everybody is very keen to lend their 2 cents and get stuck in. So I guess that's kind of how we managed to achieve it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks. There's another question, another hand up, I think, from Ananya.
I was wondering if there's any project or any location that was really close to your heart or something that was really memorable, if you want to describe that experience.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose every project and every location has been memorable for for various reasons. I think the South Pacific and some of the projects we've done there are probably, well, for me anyway, close to my heart. It's somewhere we've spent a lot of time working and probably understand best out of all the places we've worked. I think specifically one of the kind of things that stands out as a memory for me is that first build we did in our kind of third year of doing projects or kind of taking this initiative on, the Wenny kindergarten that we spoke about, just completing it and it being the first actual building we built and standing back alongside some of the kind of people in the community we've been working with, and just, I suppose looking at it and just, realizing what we'd achieved as together collaboratively. And that was a pretty special and amazing moment for me, I think. And it never wears old either. I think every time you finish a building and, everyone's put their blood, sweat and tears into it for 8 weeks or however long it's been, it's always a really rewarding thing to kind of take that step back and just appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. I think when you finish a project, it's such a great relief, because in the back of the head, there's always, when you're building it, it's always like, is this even achievable? Is this possible? Like, every time we're designing, we try and switch things up. We try and introduce something new, challenge ourselves. So it's rarely plain sailing, and there's always that little doubt of, is this just not going to be successful or not get complete in time? So it's super rewarding, but equally everything that happens off site. So the last project that I was on in Vanuatu, the Vanuatu school, we were very lucky to we were kind of 30 minutes away from a second village, which is they call it a custom village, which means they basically rejected all Western influence throughout history, basically. So they've managed to maintain their ancient traditions all the way right up until now. So we were fortunate. I mean, the family that I was staying with, my family were originally from that village, so they had access to go there, and it's just such an amazing opportunity to work on these projects, to see completely other ways of living and other ways of life that you'd never normally have an insight to as a tourist, or never have that kind of opportunity to visit and learn about. So we spent some time in that other village, and it's just really interesting to see. I mean, they have no education, no currency, no clothes, no toiletries, no sanitation. So it's as far removed from Western civilization as you can kind of imagine.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I wonder if there are any more questions that anyone's kind of burning to ask at this point. Kind of looks like it might nearly be tea time, but Nathan, you've got another one. You're muted though.
Still can't get used to it. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just I suppose you really just touched on it. But the politics. How did you find the local politics and the the embracing of the community and getting their feedback in terms of working? Because like I said, I've just done a bit of a study into participation, something I'm really interested in. But I could never really find any true critical analysis, I suppose, of the bad side of it. Is there anything from your experience that kind of says, I mean, it's widely vouched as a really good practice, but there must be some bad things with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's politics in every project we work on. Local politics, and we obviously try not to get involved in it. And it's usually never. I mean, in our experience, it's not been something that we've done or done wrong that then has kind of caused local political issues or whatever. It's usually maybe squabbles between parties within a community we're working in. So an example is the 90 community hall that we built. The site of it was agreed upon originally throughout the whole design process, and I think like a couple of days before we were due to arrive there, someone in the village had said, "Oh, I've decided I'm not happy with where it's going to be sited. I want it to be sited somewhere else." And there was this kind of frenzy of trying to come to an agreement with where it should be sited. And I suppose, those are the things, we planned for so many months up to that point, exactly where the site was going to be. We'd attended meetings with the kind of elders and the heads of the village that had agreed it was going to be there. Then right at the end, this one issue kind of blows things up, and it's like, well, where are we going to build it? What are we going to do? And I think it's always just a case of making sure we sit down with everyone and understand what the needs of everyone are, and come to an agreed resolution that everyone's happy with. I think, again, we touched on it before, that making sure we're working with partners, not only NGO partners that have the trust and knowledge of that community, but also people, identifying the right figureheads or people within that community that can kind of represent the community through one person. Identifying those people early on is really key to making sure that we iron out as many of those potential issues as possible. And like I say, they obviously still do happen, but it's never been ever so bad that it's kind of been to the detriment of a project, or we've had to stop a project or anything like that. They're usually relatively minor issues, and that one's probably the example of the most major issue we've ever faced.
Cool. Cheers. I'll stay quiet now.
Well, thank you.
That's okay. Thanks, Nathan. There's another dodgy mic, perhaps, a question from Francis Lacey. How do you think we can introduce some of your principles into traditional UK practices, which are often more money-driven? And how do you think this could be beneficial? I guess there's a kind of question there over the value system, which we put on design, and the role of the designer within that field, or it might be a kind of question about really anti-capitalist mentality. But
yeah, I mean, I think we believe that any project, no matter how capitalist or corporate it is, can still have an impact on not only the people that use that building, but also the people that are involved in its process. I think, like Harry said as well, that the process of achieving a project is as valuable for creating an impact as the project itself. So really looking to involve as many people that are going to be touched or affected by the project as possible in its process generally means it's going to have a better outcome, and can have impact in that as well.
I think a way for that, maybe the way developments are run might need to be changed, in the sense that typically for a huge development, often one or two architects win the bid, and that's their job to deliver, as a matter of architecture practice, a huge scheme that for 100,000 housing units or whatever it might be. And there's no way that on a project of that scale that they're going to have a dedicated and true reflection from the community and have their input, and it's just not feasible on that kind of scale. And I think the way in which those kind of developments might be able to switch it up a little bit is to, instead of awarding one singular big practice a gigantic job, is actually split it up a lot more, a lot further down, and then start issuing much smaller practices the winning tenders for each part of that. So then you suddenly have 20 or 25 practices working on this big development, and then each of those practices have their specific project and agenda. Obviously, they're all working together to make it coherent. But by having those different, that kind of different number of parties, it's much easier for them to focus on their specific end users. So that's kind of one potential way.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're not naive to think as well that, you know, obviously if you've got a lot of designers trying to design something, it can be muddled, and equally could be more expensive if you're kind of approaching it that way. But I think it's about, you know, people realizing that actually we should be placing more value on the impacts that projects have and the kind of involvement of communities close to wherever that project's located. And that's maybe one way we can do that.
Brilliant, thank you. So that's kind of a slightly more deeper assessment as to the value of the entire design mechanism rather than just the end things you were saying earlier. Juliet, I think you're one of these with the horrible Wi-Fi. You were. So another question: what advice would you have for students who are passionate about social design but are unsure where to go after graduation or how to get into the industry? Perhaps in addition to join you and join some of those courses, I suppose.
Yeah, thanks for the plug. Yeah, I mean, I think we've always been advocates of just kind of reaching out to people, you know, reach out to as many people as you see fit and try and get your foot through the door. I think equally it's acknowledging that you're not going to necessarily find your dream job right out of uni. And I think there's also value in working at a number of different practices to find out what it is that you actually like and want to pursue. I mean, with regards to like specifically working in international development or the kind of sector we're working in, you know, I go back to what I said before of trying to kind of start a network in those places, reach out to NGOs or charities that might be working in international development projects. Again, practices similar to ours, you know, Mass Design, BuildX Studio. There's quite a few out there and a growing number of them as well now. And we find that it's actually quite a small world, and that once you get your foot in the door with one or two, you actually can, you know, reach out to quite a number of them, and everyone's quite connected. I don't know if there's...
Yeah, and just that it is very competitive. You know, almost every student and graduate wants to work in more impactful projects than the typical route, and there's just not that many jobs out there that are catering to it because there's not that much money in this industry, or this niche of the industry anyway. So I think it is just taking initiative and identifying where, if you can't find the right job that suits you, then just create your own job, find your own projects and find your own work. And the best time to do that is, you know, as soon as you graduate or at the youngest age possible, because you're only going to get more and more responsibilities and financial commitments with rent and all this stuff. So yeah, it's difficult to have the confidence to do it, but I think just, you know, sticking your neck out is the best way forward.
So the naivety can be kind of an armor, can be liberating as well.
Exactly.
Grant, maybe this is probably the last questions. We're approaching past now. So is your mic working, Grant?
My mic is working, Ollie.
All right. Is the Wi-Fi horrid, or is it?
No, the Wi-Fi is very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Evening, gentlemen. Thank you for the presentation. Firstly, it was really invigorating. So obviously throughout your presentation, you spoke about public consultation and bringing the public in and helping the community X, Y, and Z. So I'm a part-time student. I also work in practice in education. So I'm sort of well aware with the whole public consultation, you know, going around the neighbours' doors and letters through the post box, X, Y, Z. So you obviously took this to sort of a next level, I guess, didn't you? So, you know, on a sort of day-to-day basis, how did that look? It's quite intriguing from my perspective anyway. So yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I guess we just do like one project kind of example would be, let's say if we've got a school build in the UK, then the first thing that we would do is to look to get those students involved themselves in that design process. I mean, it's quite, how often do people get to shape the spaces that they actually inhabit that are around them, especially, kids, and, how great would it be for kids in the school to, be like, oh, I helped, put that together, or that came from my imagination. And it's, we're not naive as to think that these kids are going to start drawing up these amazing designs and these plans and everything. It's much more about translating translating ideas, or what an idea could be, into an actual feasible project. So right now we're working with a school in South Wales as part of an initiative that we're trying to roll out anyway, which is to do with diversifying the architectural profession. So working with much younger aged kids in areas that maybe don't have as many opportunities, or working with students that don't necessarily see architecture as a career path that's for them.
Mm-hmm.
And running these kind of short workshops. So this one, I say short, this one's running over quite a long period of time, but the actual build will take place over the course of like 1 or 2 intense weeks, and be for a kind of small structure. Yeah. And the way in which those kids are involved is we kind of abstract architecture in a sense. So it's getting people to understand what spaces they enjoy being in and why. So existing spaces around their house, what's their favorite room, why is it their favorite room?
Okay.
And then taking those principles and then asking them how they would actually make it better. So, okay, your bedroom's your favorite place because your toys are there, but what's the issue? Is like, are they all over the floor? Is there not enough storage? Why is there not enough storage? Can it be built in? Can that storage become a sofa? Can it be all of these different things? So it becomes a lot more relatable to people, rather than abstract ideas that architects usually talk about, and these thresholds or moments that mean absolutely nothing to the general public. So I guess it's kind of dumbing it all down, taking away a lot of the pretentiousness from architecture, and realizing that, okay, of course, nobody's going to start drawing up these beautiful, amazing things, but actually everybody is imaginative. Everybody has ideas that they want to see turned into something real.
I think, and a key point from that as well is that it's about trying to get the end user or the community involved right from the very start, rather than typically on some UK projects, you often get public consultations where it's a case of, here's a design we've already done, what do you think of it? And then obviously all the community hates it. It's about really right from the start assessing that need, and as we said, sometimes in that process we found out that actually a building isn't the best thing we could do for that end user. And so I think that's key as well.
Fine. So just on that then, so you physically carried out workshops, which I think is awesome in itself. But at what sort of age do you start getting responses? Because me going into a school and asking some 6-year-old lad, what do you reckon the school should be? I can imagine could produce some sort of barrier. Is there a certain age, or is it just all encapsulating?
I think the questions you're asking vary depending on what the age, and that's what I was saying about kind of trying to dumb down the concept of what it is what architecture is and what we're asking. So we might maybe ask more spatial related questions to someone that's a bit older that might have a better understanding of it, whereas then it's talking to someone much younger, it's asking much simpler questions that aren't really specific to spatial needs and things. It's just getting to know that person more personally, and then how they might use their space rather than what they want from their space, for example.
Yeah. Oh, that's really awesome. Cheers, lads. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Grant. I think we're pretty much out of time. Maybe as a parting note from Nathan, he was asking where to sign up for the workshops. I'm sure you guys can perhaps give us some contact details for those things, and I'll send them around as well. But if you perhaps can drop anything into the chat here, that would be useful as well.
We'll send that through as well. On our website, there's well, there's loads of stuff all about what we've just talked about, impact reports there as well, but also our join us page is where all of the kind of workshops are located.
And actually, I'm going to finish on one last question, which is kind of related to the architecture spiel and all of the kind of useless stuff that we perhaps teach at university. I'm wondering, what are the skills that you really learned as a student which have been the most useful for you in trying to deliver these projects?
I think for me, it's probably understanding and really extracting what's important in a brief, and even extracting a brief in the first place is, I think, a skill it's maybe not explicitly taught, but you pick up through the education you gain in architecture school. And then also from disseminating what that brief is, how you solve that problem, I think isn't something that someone writes down and says this is how you do it, but it's definitely something that you learn through that education that I think has been so invaluable to the way we now approach any problem, not necessarily just a design problem, which I think is really transferable as well.
Yeah, definitely the methodology of approaching any problem can really be, if you interview tons of architecture graduates, there'll be a whole host of them that aren't working in architecture at all, but those same skills can so easily be transferred to anything creative, anything written. It's still the same principle of what's the issue, how do you solve it, what's the solution, and whether that's in a storybook or a branding proposal, it's still the same kind of methodology that is taught in designing a project as it is designing, whatever you're doing. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you both very much, Josh and Harry. That's great. And thank you everyone for those